All right, today we're diving into a really tough idea. Something that honestly can be pretty unsettling when you first encounter it in these ancient texts. The concept of a hardened heart.
We throw around phrases like cold-hearted or stone-hearted all the time, right? But what if, and this is a big what if someone being that way wasn't entirely their own choice? What if God actually made them that way? That's the huge, challenging question we're going to tackle.
Okay, so to really wrap our heads around this, we're going to start with a super famous story. We're going way back to ancient Egypt, a case study really, from the book of Exodus. Think powerful king, crazy miracles, that's our setting. So at the center of this story is the king of Egypt, the Pharaoh. This guy is basically the most powerful person on the planet at the time. We're talking millions of lives in his hands. And he gets locked into this major battle of wills, a confrontation that's just filled with these mind-blowing miracles, or as the text calls them, signs and wonders.
And here's where it gets really interesting. Pay close attention to what the text says here. This is before all the major drama, before the plagues really kick off. It says, flat out, that God will harden the king's heart. It's not a reaction, it's a proactive move. The ending is spelled out from the start. The king is not going to listen. Wild, right?
So you have to wonder, right, was this whole thing with Pharaoh just a one-time deal, a special case for a specific moment in history? Or is this pointing to something bigger, a principle that's at play in more than just this one story?
Okay, let's zoom out. We're going to jump from that one story in Egypt and look at a different text. This one lays out a much broader principle, something that's less about one king and more about, well, how this all works on a bigger scale.
All right, before we go any further, let's make sure we're all on the same page with the main term here, divine hardening. What these texts are talking about is the idea that God actively makes someone's heart resistant to change or belief. So it's not just, letting it happen. It's causing it to happen. That's the core idea we're digging into.
And boom, here's that principle laid out in black and white. This quote is pretty blunt. It puts two things right next to each other, having mercy and hardening a heart. And it says both of them are just expressions of God's will, a choice that gets made.
So you see the parallel, right? It's like two sides of the same coin. Showing mercy, that's an intentional choice. Well, according to this text, hardening is the exact same kind of thing. It's not passive, it's a deliberate action. So the key takeaway here is that both of these things, compassion and making someone resistant, are presented as coming from the same place, the same will.
And I bet I know what you're thinking right now, because it's the obvious, massive question, why? I mean, seriously, what's the point? If the goal is supposed to be things like healing or salvation, why would you actively stop someone from getting there? It doesn't seem to make any sense. Well, our last piece of the puzzle here actually gives us an answer. It's a pretty startling one. It tackles that why question directly, and it connects a hardened heart to a very specific and, honestly, a very difficult outcome.
Whoa, okay, let's just sit with this for a second because there is a lot packed into that. This verse is saying that two things happen. Eyes are blinded and hearts are hardened for a very specific reason, so that people can't see, can't understand, and therefore can't turn back, which is what would get them healed. It's a heavy-duty claim.
So let's just trace the logic here, step by step. It's basically a chain reaction. Step 1 and 2, blind their eyes, harden their hearts. That's the cause. And what's the effect? Step 3, they won't turn around. And what does that prevent? Step 4, they won't get healed. It's a straight line of logic. And it's a real challenge to think about.
Okay, so where are we now? We've looked at a specific story, a general rule, and a really tough reason behind it all. Let's try to weave all three of these threads together and see what the bigger picture looks like.
So here's the breakdown, the three layers we've peeled back. First, we have the example, the king of Egypt who is hardened, even with miracles happening all around him. That pointed us to the bigger principle, that hardening is an act of God's will, just like showing mercy is. And finally, we got a purpose, a tough one to swallow, that it's done to actually stop someone from seeing, understanding, and ultimately being healed.
When you put it all together like that, you can't help but feel this deep tension, right? It's a real puzzle. On one hand, you have this idea of God taking direct action. On the other hand, you have human choice and responsibility. And those two things seem to be in a really complicated dance here.
And that leaves us with the one huge question that just hangs in the air, the one these texts force you to ask. If a heart is hardened so that someone can't turn back, then who's really responsible when they don't? There is no simple answer to that. It gets into these massive ideas of free will, justice, and, well, the very nature of God. And that question is really the heart of this whole tough but fascinating subject.